Uh, I'm going to talk a little bit about cultural loss and compensation from the perspective, trying to put it into the broader perspective of anthropological discussions about those questions. Um, in considering the implications of the turn towards loss that we're seeing with the rise of the notion of a compensable act, and all the other kinds of legal and political developments in Australian society, whereby loss and damages and hurt feelings and questions of reparations are being raised, which extends from class actions to considerations under the Queensland Human Rights Act, which now enshrines a right to enjoy culture, to discussions, I think, of reparations and truth-telling in the broader political sphere. And I'm, talking to an article in the journal American Anthropologist, which is open access, so it's freely available. But to think about what it means to turn from concepts of continuity, resilience, and survival and culture, where I think anthropological discussions of Aboriginal life, Indigenous life have been held for 50 years, towards thinking about loss. And I think it's a significant paradigm shift, which mirrors the shift that Joel Robbins talks about from the cultural point to the suffering subject. And I think that, there is a sense that it's a contagious consideration, and hopefully that'll become clearer what I mean, insofar as it's changing the way in which we talk about Indigenous life and Indigenous peoples' self-presentation of their own history and culture, I think in potentially far-reaching ways. And as I've mentioned, it's occurring in a variety of contexts, including, most significantly compensation, but in these other settings. And the discussions are arising, in relation to climate change big time. In the Pacific, there's people working on questions of loss and compensation reparations. But I've argued that I think it's tricky for us in anthropology because it sort of implicates the discipline's role in talking about culture, and it sort of requires us to engage with that role in all of its ambivalence, in the ways in which anthropology has historically framed Aboriginal tradition and language, objects, and so on, as a list of things that people have or that they don't have or that they have not. And that understanding has sort of spread widely, and it's probably continued to be embraced outside the discipline, even as many anthropologists have sought to think more holistically about change. So I think that a broader point is that just as the concept of culture has proved problematic, and there's lots of writing about that, so too as we turn to think about loss and elicit all these feelings associated with it, it's an interesting time, and that it will influence people's sense of loss and change it in unpredictable ways. In some ways, as Stuart Kirsch, writing about Marshall Islands, says cultural loss is a critical blind spot of the culture concept, because we've tended to define culture as something which continually changes rather than something that can be damaged or lost. But people are increasingly, it seems to me, expressing a sense of loss. So how can we make sense of that? And I've argued that we can't do so simply by an analysis of the quantum of culture that's been transmitted, but neither can we simply talk about cultural change, because all loss involves change and the perception that things are different from the way they used to be or perhaps ought to have become. However, many different types of change are not viewed as loss. So conceptually, I think there are a number of questions. How do we distinguish loss from change? And how are the concepts of loss and change entangled? Who experiences loss? And whose loss is it? And of course, the question of valuation, in which anthropologists are now participating. How much is it worth? So they're difficult questions for anthropology because for 50 years now, we've not focused on loss particularly. Early literature does, of course, focus directly and insensitively and simplistically on loss. And I've taken a flowchart from Elkin's paper of 1951, where he describes patterns or stages of loss, insensitively and in many ways offensively. And you might think also of Lawrence Sharp, who famously wrote about the collapse of what he called year-round people's culture, which was occasioned by the introduction of steel axes, foreshadowing, I think he says, the entire collapse of the culture, if not the extinction of the biological group itself. So there's a very kind of simplistic, functional interpretation of cultural change in that classical literature, which Marshall Sahlins describes as a very ethnocentric anthropological vision of the other that based on all these binaries between, classical and post-classical Aboriginal life or traditional people and historical people. And Silence writes that when we change, it's called progress, but when they do, notably when they adopt some of our things, it's a kind of adulteration, a loss of their culture. So, in the article, I kind of make the point that, there's a heavy critique of Sharp, for example, John Taylor and many others, Basil Sampson, work through that paper, point to the many continuities. There's a heavy critique of that classical focus on loss after the 1970s, because as Austin Bruce puts it, the main objective of researchers in the land rights era was to establish continuities of spiritual affiliations to land, not change. And of course, many researchers have written about the encounter with the deliberate politics of cultural revival, focused on proud attempts to recuperate aspects of culture. And I think that's axiomatic amongst anthropologists. It's an article of faith. And for many Indigenous people, culture is the currency of liberation politics. It's essential to that, and it's often founded on essentialisms and statements which disavow any meaningful change. And I'm thinking, for example, of Morton Robinson's embrace of the notion of ontology as an unchanging aspect of Indigenous connection to land that, as she puts it, notwithstanding the embrace of the cultural forms of the colonizer, these things have not diminished the ontological relationship to land. So the literature's full of statements like this, which I think are unhelpful in thinking about loss and the feelings that might have arisen from the alienation of land. So, of course, it's Timber Creek. Scholars have been addressing this, and there are examples from Kingsley Palmer and Pam McGrath. And in the international literature, I mentioned Stuart Kirsch writing about the impacts of atomic testing at the Marshall Islands and around the Exxon Valdez and the Deepwater Horizon disasters, which focus very much on some of the evidentiary issues of substantiating losses and what I understand the courts to consider cultural loss as damage to the cultural value of native title inflicted by another. Now, as the jurisprudence is evolving, the courts have come to consider how those cultural connections to the land, those native title connections, have been affected by the compensable acts and how to value the effects of those compensable acts. And I think this is where anthropology, is involved in the making of value. And some of the literature around valuation is useful for thinking about this role. Evaluation and valorization that's embedded in making value. And the New South Wales Valuer General's report gives some insights into how this is developing as forms of loss, focus on things like access, residence, activities, practices, ecology, sites, trauma, and progressive impairment or incremental and cumulative loss of feeling or connection to country, while making the point that for the purposes of assessing compensation, the various forms of loss are to be considered as a cumulative whole rather than individually. So, of course, these forms of compensable loss will change as the jurisprudence matures. And we start to think anthropologically about this notion of a compensable act and how to address what loss is and means for Aboriginal peoples with, as I understand it, loss understood as collective rather than individual under these or other forms of loss via a focus on the incremental, cumulative and intergenerational effects of compensable acts. And obviously this relies on the existence of a continuing system of law and custom giving rise to a value that's then destroyed or harmed, meaning that areas that have suffered most severely from colonisation seem to be likely to receive the least redress for loss under native title compensation, but, potentially not other considerations of treaty making and so on. But I think this legal conceptualization of loss does pose questions and challenges for us in anthropology, at least in relation to the broader academic literature. Because of the mutual entanglement of feelings of change and the concept of change with the concept of loss. And I think that the tendency to produce an inventory of cultural traits which people have maintained or lost doesn't really answer the question of what loss means for people. Thinking about the quantum of knowledge or the number of cultural traits that people transmit only partly gets us there. And it's been my experience in the Gulf country that people also feel a strong sense of loss for things which survive, for example, and that there are other complexities for us to grapple with. Of course, the perception of loss is accompanied by emotions such as pain, regret, grief, and shame, as well as nostalgia, regret, and denial. And I think these contradictory emotions indicate how difficult it is to conceptualize loss, which is as much a feeling about change as a quantifiable thing that's mutually entangled and difficult to discern from the kinds of normative statements about culture that are easy to elicit and that we tend to record. So how do we get at loss in that case? And I make the point that I think it's very difficult, it's complex, and I've encountered a lot of nostalgia amongst Aboriginal people in the Gulf country. And I think we work typically with older people, and that's possibly partly why we get this sense of nostalgia coming into our ethnography. But people talk surprisingly about how things were better at Normanton on the reserve, notwithstanding the difficult physical setting they face there and the discrimination. People have a great nostalgia for life on the cattle stations, despite stolen wages. People express a sense that everything is ruined now. Everything's finished. Everything's dead. The young people are hopeless. These kinds of comments are sometimes typical of people. And I think nostalgia is partly a kind of denial as well as a kind of mourning, and a way that people are acknowledging the impacts of their own choices in producing loss. I've typically recorded people expressing regret about not listening or drinking. And of course, these are misplaced allocations of blame. But in some respects, they're expressions of agency when people say, I didn't listen. I wish I'd have asked the old people that. They're also an expression that people want to make different choices in the future, I think, and there are ways in which we can perceive nostalgia as positive, but it's fundamentally, it seems, uncertain and unpredictable. So I think people are experiencing loss and letting go of things in these kinds of complicated ways that are hard for us to research and to get at. And they reflect the complex views on, for example, who is to blame for damage, and inwardly focused emotions are commonly felt, I think, amongst those I've worked with in the Gulf, which give us an insight into the kinds of feelings involved in the experience of loss, prompted by the sense that things are not as they were, things are not as they could have been, and that someone is to blame or could perhaps be blamed. And that's not always clear. And it seems to shift as agency for change and blame for loss is widely distributed. And I think people also differ in how they may distinguish between a desirable change and a regrettable loss. For example, many people view the decline of things like marriages, arranged marriages, as positive, and the decline of sorcery as a good thing. And people will commonly in the Gulf, although perhaps less so now, express pity for those who lived in the bush before colonisation. And these things vary between people as the experience of loss varies. And I think the experience of loss also changes over time in who it affects and how people are affected by it. For example, a change experienced positively by members of one generation may come to be experienced as loss by the next, or not. An experience of loss may come to be considered to be a change into the future. young people may experience a change that their elders view differently. I think that these things are yet to be grappled with. And they reveal the complexity of these kinds of feelings about change and loss. I think it's also the case that while some aspects of loss are straightforward to elicit and easier for people to articulate, others are not. So many people, in my experience, express a sense of loss as a feeling that something's missing without knowing what is missing or how to put it into words. And the question of how such loss may come to be valued or not is an interesting one. So I guess I've put a few provocations into the paper in seeking to think about this concept within the legal system, but also some of the broader implications of it for anthropology and for how we may think about culture and change in the discipline and beyond. And some concluding points or some discussion points, perhaps, that I think the early literature addresses loss very directly and insensitively, and after the 1970s, the emphasis on continuity, resilience, and survival has led to assertions about the quantum of knowledge reproduced across the generations, which have proved to be somewhat unrealistic. I think the politics of native title deferred people from making any effort to put feelings about loss into words or to look for anyone to listen. And I think as people are now seeking to do that, we're poorly equipped to hear them. And I guess pessimistically, the embrace of culturalism and the notion that culture is a value to be defended seems to me to portend a precarious future for this kind of research, as thinking about loss will unsettle the relationship that's been built around the politics of cultural revival. And I think it's quite unpredictable. And I finished the paper and I put the provocation there that it may prove too difficult, I think, to really grapple with the challenges. It may be antithetical to anthropology to do so. And I quote from Lucas Bashire, the anthropologist who worked in the Grand Chakao, in talking about the investment in preserving primitive lifeways as a public good and a radical imaginary, and the difficulty of really grappling with the damage that was done. So I'll leave that there as a provocation.
Thanks very much for that, Martin. Do we have any questions? I think I might have missed something. Perhaps this is a better question for Colette. I'm confused here between loss of culture with cultural loss, and I think there needs to be a fairly clear distinction there. Your paper, I think, generally loss of culture is not the same for cultural loss. We're talking about the impact of acts on cultural value of a relevant land. I think that is basically. If there's a lawyer in the room that can clarify that.
I guess I think it's partly the question of translation and thinking as this concept arises and as we grapple with it in anthropology and in interaction with the law, how do we do that? And to what extent is the legal framing of that meaningful from a disciplinary perspective, I guess. It's not answering the question, but I think that these broader contexts are arising, not just in the question of native title compensation, but in the broader discourses. But it may well be that, it's a better way to think about it as harm to native title, for example, rather than cultural loss. Certainly.
Just to pick up on your last quote from Lucas Bessier, where he says, investment in preserving primitive lifeways is a public good. The idea of public good, it seems to me that there is such an investment generally in Australia as well, in the idea of preserving some notion of Aboriginal life, Aboriginality as a public good. And we see that in a whole lot of ways, and ways which possibly override or ignore all the kinds of changes and losses that you're trying to talk about. So I'm just wondering, from the disciplinary point of view, how you see what would appear then to be a sort of elective affinity between anthropology and this notion of the public good and the preservation of a primitive lifeway. If, for example, you contrast it with sociology, let's say, where into the 1970s you had people like Charles Rowley who were writing books called The Destruction of Aboriginal Society and so on. Granted that he later modified that somewhat by writing a book about the revival of Aboriginals, something, I forget what the exact title was. But I mean, there seems perhaps to have been a somewhat lesser investment in, let's say, sociology and in history in preserving some notion of culture and culture as continuous. And you're also getting at a very rich vein of information and observations about what Indigenous people themselves say about their experiences of things as change, as loss, as something else, as things they don't even comment on. And I think it's interesting and a good idea to get into that. I think there is a lot of that already in the literature, which maybe needs to be sort of mined or looked at more carefully, because I think there are a lot of comments about older people, especially saying when they're asked about the practice of culture and so on, they say, well, they've all died. So there is some way in which people constantly tie the notion of passage of older people and their death to the kind of loss and the disappearance of culture and so on and so forth. But my main question here is about the disciplinary differences. How would you see that? How would you look at anthropology as opposed to, or in relation to, let's say, sociology and history, just to pick a couple?
It's a rich question and comment, and I think that it goes to the concept of culture, and anthropologists as the kind of culture person, I think, and the framing of the role in dialogue with Indigenous people, and the ways in which people will talk about culture and express those feelings with us. And I'm not answering the question well, but it will be interesting to explore how other kinds of social sciences and histories might engage with all of this. And, it's surprising to me that, for example, our colleagues in sociology, I think, have some methodologies which would be helpful in thinking about change, but with a much less focus on Indigenous life.
Mm. So I'm really curious. So, for example, if there's a native title claim that was determined 10 years ago, and now it's the subject of a compensation claim. Will there does that pose any challenges for the determination of the previous native title determination? So, if, for example, there was if we pick up a particular component of the native title claim that was very strong in asserting that this aspect of their culture is still very much alive, is very much a continuation of that practice. But then 10 years later, it becomes another important component of a compensation claim that's then, watering maybe that aspect of the evidence down. Does that put the original native title claim at harm? Like, does that have an effect on that native title claim? I don't know. That's
Josh, maybe Kingsley can answer that one.
Do you want to answer that, Kingsley?
Is that a question, huh?
Well, it raises an interesting issue. I don't know if that's come about, but I mean, potentially if the claims can be reheard and challenged, as I understand, I don't think that's happened yet. So the difference between a native title application and determination and compensation is that they're talking about in completely different ends of the spectrum. So it's a good point to make. But look at that. No, I've finally got the microphone. The observation and the question is that I think I read your original paper and I've been seeing this and basically in. Is a very useful, if I may say so, is a very useful review of the whole idea of lots of different perspectives on the idea of loss. And the question for us as native title practitioners who are doing compensation is, of course, how many of these different aspects of loss are compensable? Because however good the anthropology might be, the lawyers we end up serving are not going to be particularly interested in avenues which are not compensable, because it's becoming increasingly clear that many things which could be regarded as cultural loss are not compensable under native title. They don't really know yet how many there will be. So that's kind of observation I'd be interested to hear what you have, how you look perhaps the net through what you've done to come up with the main things that you think might be important. The other thing is a little bit different, an observation and also a question. You talk about valuing loss, and then in the say just about 4 lines later, you actually talk about cultural value. And I think the two are very, very different. And I'm a little alarmed at your suggestion or implication that as anthropologists, we should be trying to put a value on loss, as opposed to making a distinction between creating an understanding of what is cultural loss and how we could understand degrees of it. It's very tricky, but the two are very, very different. It is, in my view, it is certainly not our job in any way to put a monetary value. Compensation is not entirely or solely, as I understand it, about financial compensation. But so far, that is has been yielded both in the public determinations and the private ones, as far as we know, which are paid most. So, thank you.
Yeah, I guess I was trying to make the point that anthropologists are participating in a process of valuation, and maybe that participation is in, the kind of cultural translation that is required, and in the perception of the complex kinds of feelings that may not be easy to articulate in a contested setting of a litigated claim. Not that there's a value that an anthropological methodology may produce as a result of fieldwork or analysis, if that clarifies the question.
James Rhodes, University of Melbourne. This is what people say is more a contribution question. My PhD student, John Little, who was based at Origin Youth and Health Centre at Origin, is now in the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health with me, has published the Veteran Psychiatry, excellent article, important advice about the conversion of these issues, which take us away from the problem of trying to understand cultural value and squarely into the arena of understanding harm as a valuable as a metric in the legal setting, but linked firmly to culture. So Joel is an initiated RFA, Robert Splendid, and a very promising young cultural expert and psychiatrist.